The wind in this part of Wyoming had a voice. It was not the gentle whisper of the prairie grasses or the sighing of the pines. It was a mournful, hungry sound that scraped along the edges of the canyon, a constant reminder of the emptiness that had swallowed Clara Langley's life whole. For 6 months. That wind had been her only steady companion, its howl a fitting chorus to the silence inside her. Her cabin stood 100 yards from the precipice, a gray, weathered box of timber clinging to the unforgiving land. It had once been a home, filled with the scent of baking bread and Nathan's loud, booming laughter. Now, it smelled of dust and disuse, of a hearth long gone cold. The vibrant quilts her mother had stitched were faded, the floorboards bare and splintered. Everything that had once held warmth and color seemed to have been leached away, leaving only the stark bones of a life that was no more. Clara, too, was faded. At 24, she should have been in the full bloom of her youth, but grief and fear had carved fine lines around her eyes and mouth, and her hair, once the color of autumn leaves, seemed to hold more dust than light. She was thin, the sharp angles of her collarbones and hips pressing against the worn calico of her dress. She moved through her days like a ghost in her own home, tending the small, stubborn patch of garden that provided her meager sustenance, her hands working from memory while her mind drifted elsewhere. It always drifted to the canyon. Every afternoon, when the sun began its slow descent and painted the rock walls in bruised shades of purple and orange, she would walk to the edge. It was a pilgrimage of penance. The townsfolk in Jericho Springs, 5 miles down the dusty road, thought she was mad, cursed. They had their stories, spun from the threads of suspicion and sanctimony. The women whispered them over laundry lines and in the dry goods store, their voices sharp as sewing needles. She pushed him. I tell you, Martha Gable, the storekeeper's wife, would say, her lips pursed into a knot of certainty. Nathan was a strong man, sure-footed as a goat. He wouldn't just slip. Others, like the pious Mrs. Miller, preferred a tale of sin. It was another man, Nathan found out, and in the struggle, well, the Lord does not suffer the adulteress. They called her the Canyon Widow. They said the wind that haunted the chasm was the devil's breath, and that Clara Langley had made a pact with it. When she rode into town for flour and salt, a rare and dreaded necessity, the whispers would follow her like stray dogs. The men would stare, their eyes a mixture of pity and a crude, unspoken curiosity. The women would pull their children close, as if her sorrow were a contagion. She learned to keep her gaze fixed on the dirt street, to make her transactions in as few words as possible, and to flee back to the silence of her isolated world. The silence was a liar. It was never truly quiet. In the stillness of her cabin, she heard Nathan's voice, the way it could turn from honey to venom in a heartbeat. She saw his face in the warped reflection of a window pane, his handsome features twisted by drink and rage. And at the canyon's edge, the wind carried the echoes of that final night, the shriek of the storm, the slickness of the rain-soaked rock under her feet, the reek of whiskey on his breath. She never let herself remember all of it at once. The memories came in shards, sharp and cruel, his fingers digging into her arm, bruising the bone, his words, slurred and ugly, accusing her of imagined sins, the terrifying moment when he had shoved her toward the edge, his face a mask of fury and a flash of lightning. You want to fly, little bird? I'll teach you how to fly. She remembered scrambling backward, the terror a cold, hard stone in her throat. And then, his triumphant laugh turning into a grunt of surprise as his own boot heel skidded on a patch of wet moss. He had reached for her, his eyes wide, not with rage, but with sudden, stark fear. For a split second, his hand had brushed against hers. Then he was gone, his scream swallowed by the roar of the wind and the chasm's dark mouth. Guilt was a living thing inside her. It was not the guilt the town imagined. It was the guilt of survival, the guilt of that fleeting, terrible moment of relief that had pierced through her terror as he fell. She had not pushed him, But she had not saved him. She had let him go. And so she returned to the canyon each day, as if standing on that ledge could somehow unravel the past, or at least punish her enough to make peace with it. On this day, the sky had been a placid, washed-out blue, but the west was a fickle master. As Clara stood on the familiar outcrop of rock, staring into the depths, the air grew heavy and still. A strange, greenish light bled across the horizon, and the wind, her constant companion, fell silent. It was the hush before a storm, a breath held in the lungs of the world. She should have turned back. Any sensible person would have seen the bruised knuckles of clouds massing in the west and sought shelter. But sense had long since abandoned her. She was held captive by the memory, her feet rooted to the spot where her life had fractured. The first crack of thunder was a cannon shot directly overhead, making her flinch. The sky ripped open. Rain came down not in drops, but in a solid, blinding sheet, cold as ice. The world dissolved into a gray, roaring chaos. Disoriented, she stumbled, turning back toward the faint outline of her cabin, but the path had turned to a treacherous river of mud. Lightning split the sky, and in its momentary, brilliant glare, the canyon's edge seemed to leap toward her. Her foot slipped. She cried out, a thin, useless sound lost in the storm's fury. She fell to her hands and knees, the coarse grit of the rock scraping her palms. The chasm was right there, a breath away, its dark throat promising the same oblivion that had taken Nathan. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. The storm of 6 months ago and the storm of now became one. She was trapped in the same nightmare. "No," she whispered, her voice choked with rain and terror. "Please, no." She closed her eyes, her body trembling uncontrollably. She felt a phantom grip on her arm, heard a drunken slur in the wind. A sob tore from her throat, a desperate plea to a God she no longer believed in. "Don't let me fall alone." Through the din, another sound registered, the heavy, rhythmic beat of a horse's hooves, struggling through the mud. A shape emerged from the downpour, a man on a big, dark horse, a silhouette of grim determination against the violent sky. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had even come to a full stop, his movements economical and sure. Eli McCrae had been fighting the storm for the better part of an hour, his head down, the brim of his hat channeling water away from his face. He was heading for the old McCrae homestead, a place he hadn't seen in over a decade, a place he was not sure he was ready to see now. The war had taken much from him, and the years that followed had taken the rest. He was a man accustomed to hardship, but this storm was a particularly vicious one. He was just looking for a place to wait it out when he saw her, a small, dark shape, huddled perilously close to the canyon. For a moment, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, that she was an apparition born of the lightning. Then he saw her slip, and instinct took over. He reached her in a few long strides, his boots sinking into the mud. She was on her knees, her face pale as bone, her eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond the storm. She was shivering violently, her thin dress plastered to her skin, offering no protection from the biting wind and rain. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You need to get away from here." She looked up at him, but her gaze seemed to pass right through him, fixed on some horror only she could see. Her lips moved, and he had to lean closer to hear her faint, desperate whisper over the howl of the wind. "Don't let me fall alone." The words struck him with a strange force. They were not the words of a woman afraid of a storm. They were the plea of a soul at the very edge of its own abyss. Without another thought, he scooped her into his arms. She was startlingly light, a bundle of cold limbs and trembling fear. She gave a small cry of protest, a weak push against his chest, but there was no strength in it. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the feverish heat of her skin even through his wet shirt. The cabin was a barely visible smudge in the deluge. He carried her toward it, his body shielding hers from the worst of the wind. Each step was a battle against the sucking mud and the gale that sought to push them back toward the canyon. He kicked the door open and carried her into the single, dark room. The air inside was frigid and damp. Gently, he set her down on the narrow cot that served as a bed. She curled into herself, her teeth chattering. "Leave me be," she mumbled, the words slurred by fever and exhaustion. Eli ignored her. He saw the state of the place in the dim light. The bare shelves, the empty wood box, the pervasive sense of neglect. This was a place where someone had given up. His jaw tightened. He moved with a purpose born of long practice in desperate situations. He found a few splintered logs and some kindling under the cot and worked quickly, his hands sure and steady as he coaxed a flame to life in the stone fireplace. The fire caught, sputtering at first, then growing into a small, defiant circle of warmth and light. It pushed back the shadows, revealing the woman on the bed more clearly. Her face was smudged with dirt, her dark red hair clinging to her cheeks in wet tangles. He saw the raw scrapes on her palms. He saw the deep, hollowed-out look in her eyes, a look he recognized. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers who had witnessed too much, men haunted by things they could never unsee. Her wet clothes were a danger. If she stayed in them, the fever would surely worsen. He hesitated for only a moment. This was a matter of survival, not propriety. He found a rough wool blanket folded at the foot of the cot. "I have to get you out of these wet things," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She was barely conscious now, her protests fading into incoherent murmurs. He worked with a detached efficiency, unfastening the tiny buttons of her dress with his large, calloused fingers. He was careful not to be rough, his touch surprisingly gentle. He pulled the wet dress away, followed by the thin chemise beneath, and quickly wrapped her shivering body in the dry, scratchy blanket. He tucked it tightly around her, then went back to the fireplace, adding more wood until it was a steady, roaring blaze. He found a tin pot and filled it with water from the rain barrel outside, setting it on the hearth to warm. There was nothing else in the cabin. No food on the shelves, no coffee, no tea. Just a half-empty sack of flour and some salt. He pulled the cabin's only chair, a rickety wooden thing, near the fire and sat down, his wet clothes steaming in the heat. The storm raged outside, rattling the window panes and screaming down the chimney. But inside, a fragile peace had settled. He watched the woman on the cot. She had fallen into a troubled, feverish sleep, her brow furrowed, her hands clutching the blanket as if it were a lifeline. Hours passed. Eli did not sleep. He sat his silent vigil, listening to the storm and the woman's ragged breathing. He was a man who carried his own ghosts, who understood the landscape of loss. He had come back to this land seeking, he wasn't sure what, a piece of his past, perhaps a place to bury it. He had not expected to find another soul so clearly adrift in her own wilderness. Sometime before dawn, the fever seemed to break. Her shivering subsided, and her breathing deepened, becoming more even. She stirred, and her eyes fluttered open. In the soft, flickering firelight, they were a deep, startling blue, clouded with confusion and fear. She saw him sitting there, a large, quiet shadow, and she flinched, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Who are you?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. "Eli McCrae," he answered simply, not moving from his chair. "I found you by the canyon." Her eyes widened with a dawning horror as memory returned. The storm, the fall, his arms lifting her. She felt a flush of shame, realizing he had undressed her. "You should not be here." "You had a fever," he stated, as if it were the only explanation needed. "The storm's letting up. I'll be on my way soon enough." She watched him, wary. He was a stranger, a big man who seemed to fill her small cabin with his presence. His face was weathered, carved by sun and hardship, with a jaw that looked as stubborn as the rock of the canyon itself. There was a stillness about him, a coiled quiet that was nothing like Nathan's loud, aggressive confidence. His eyes, the color of slate, held no judgment, only a deep, abiding weariness that seemed to mirror her own. "Why did you help me?" she whispered, the question she was too afraid to ask. Eli looked from her to the fire, its flames dancing in his dark eyes. He thought of her words, the ones she had cried out into the storm. "Don't let me fall alone." He did not know her story, and he could see in the guarded terror in her eyes that she would not offer it. He did not need her to. He understood that some people carried chasms inside them, and that sometimes all a person could do was offer a steady hand to keep them from falling. He did not say any of that. He only shrugged, a slight movement of his broad shoulders. "It was the decent thing to do," he said, his voice low and even. "No one should be out in a storm like that." He turned his gaze back to her, and for the first time, she did not flinch away. "You should get some more rest, ma'am." Clara said nothing more. She laid her head back down, but she did not close her eyes. She watched the stranger who had pulled her back from the edge, a man whose quiet tenderness was more unsettling than any cruelty she had ever known. Outside, the wind was finally dying down, its mournful howl softening to a weary sigh. But inside the rundown cabin, a new and unfamiliar storm was just beginning to gather. The morning after the storm broke with a pale, fragile light, washing the world clean. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the sky was a tender, bruised blue. Inside the cabin, the fire had dwindled to glowing embers, and a chill had begun to seep back into the room. Clara was awake when Eli came back inside, his boots heavy with mud. He had been outside for some time, and he carried with him the cold, fresh scent of the new day. She was sitting up on the cot, the rough blanket pulled to her chin, her hair a wild tangle around her pale face. The fever had left her weak and aching, but her eyes were clear, and they followed him with a guarded intensity. The shame of her vulnerability was a hot flush on her cheeks. A strange man had found her at her lowest, had carried her, had undressed her. The intimacy of it, however necessary, felt like a violation of the sterile solitude she had built around herself. "The storm took down a section of your fence," he said, his voice quiet as he added a log to the embers. "The north side, by the creek bed." He did not look at her as he spoke, giving her the dignity of his averted gaze. He moved to the small washstand, poured water from the pitcher into the basin, and splashed it on his face, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet cabin. "You should go," Clara said, her voice thin but firm. "I am grateful for your help, but you have no reason to stay." Eli dried his face on a small, threadbare towel. He turned to look at her then, and his expression was unreadable. "Your garden's exposed. A deer or two could finish off what little you've got left before noon." He paused, his slate-gray eyes holding hers. "I'm heading into town for supplies. I'll get what I need to mend the fence. Should not take more than a day." It was not a question or an offer. It was a statement of fact. Clara felt a surge of protest rise in her throat, but it died before it could form a word. She was too tired to argue. More than that, some small, treacherous part of her was relieved. The thought of being utterly alone again, with the memory of the storm and her collapse so fresh, was a terror she could not face. She simply nodded, a barely perceptible motion, and watched as he picked up his hat, gave a curt nod in return, and left the cabin, the door closing with a soft click behind him. The ride to Jericho Springs was cold, the wind carrying a lingering bite. Eli urged his horse along the muddy track, his mind a landscape as bleak as the one around him. He passed the abandoned turnoff to his family's old land without a glance. He was not ready for those ghosts yet. He had enough of his own. The sight of a lone hawk circling high above a barren ridge sent a familiar chill down his spine. It threw him back a decade, to a different sky, thick with the smoke of cannon fire and the stench of death. Virginia. The mud there had been the same, a greedy, sucking thing that pulled at a man's boots and his soul. He had been just a boy then, barely 18, fighting for a cause he had stopped believing in months before. His younger brother, Thomas, had still believed. Thomas, with his bright, unwavering eyes and his talk of honor, had seen the world in clean lines of right and wrong. The memory came as it always did, in a sudden, brutal flash, the chaos of the retreat, the shouted orders lost in the din of battle, the moment of decision, stark and terrible. Stay and die for a lost cause, or run and live with the shame. He had chosen to live. He had grabbed Thomas's arm, trying to pull him back, but Thomas had shaken him off, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. "We do not run. Eli, we are not cowards." Eli had run. He had scrambled through the woods, the sounds of the battle fading behind him, his brother's accusation echoing louder than any gunshot. He had deserted, he learned later, from a ragged newspaper weeks after the surrender. What had happened? Thomas and a handful of others had been captured, labeled traitors for refusing to yield. They had been executed by their own commanding officer in a final, futile act of defiance. His brother had died for honor, and Eli had lived with the brand of cowardice and the corrosive guilt of survival. He had betrayed the only person in the world who had ever looked up to him. That guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that the brightest sun could not burn away. He rode into Jericho Springs with that shadow clinging to him. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen or so wooden buildings, a saloon, a blacksmith, a church, and Gable's Mercantile. When he pushed open the door to the store, the little bell above it jangled, and the handful of customers within fell silent. All eyes turned to him. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval, stood behind the counter. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone as frosty as a winter morning. "Need some flour, coffee, bacon," Eli said, his voice flat. "And a roll of wire, some nails." As he listed the items, he could hear the whispers begin behind him, a low, venomous buzz. "That's him, the one staying with the Canyon widow." He felt the weight of their stares, the judgment thick enough to taste. He had been on the receiving end of looks like that his whole life. It seemed deserter, drifter. Now, he was something else, tainted by his association with the town pariah. "Mr." Gable emerged from the back room, a stout man with wary eyes. He measured out the supplies, his movements deliberate and slow. "Fixing a fence, are you?" he asked, not looking at Eli. "That's right." Gable finished bagging the flour and pushed it across the counter. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You're a stranger here. You don't know the ways of this place." He paused, wiping his hands on his apron. "Some folks, some places, are best left to themselves. That canyon's got a bad history, tends to swallow people up." It was not advice. It was a warning, as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. Eli looked up from the counter and met the man's gaze. He said nothing. He simply held the storekeeper's stare until Gable's eyes flickered away, unnerved by the cold stillness he saw there. Eli paid for his goods, loaded them into his saddlebags, and left the store without another word. The silence he left behind him as heavy as a shroud. When he returned to the cabin, Clara was on her feet, dressed in a clean, mended gown. She had swept the floor and was kneading a small lump of dough on the rough-hewn table. She looked up when he entered, her expression a mixture of apprehension and defiance. Eli said nothing about his trip to town. He simply set the sack of supplies on the table. Her eyes widened when she saw the coffee, the slab of bacon, the generous bag of flour. It was more food than she had seen in months. I cannot pay you for this," she stammered, her gaze fixed on the bounty. "Didn't ask you to," he said gruffly. turning to leave. "I'll be out at the fence." The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Eli worked from sunup to sundown. His hammer blows a steady, percussive beat against the vast silence. He was a meticulous worker, resetting the posts, stretching the new wire taut until the fence was stronger than it had ever been. Clara watched him from the cabin window, her hands busy with chores, her mind in turmoil. His presence was a profound disruption. For 6 months, her life had been a closed loop of grief and penance. She had accepted her isolation as a just punishment, but this man, with his quiet competence and his unexpected acts of kindness, was prying open her carefully constructed prison. When he was near, the air in the cabin felt different, less heavy. The whispers of her memory seemed to fade, pushed back by the solid reality of his existence. This newfound comfort terrified her. It felt like a betrayal of Nathan, of the life they had shared. However flawed, was it so easy to forget? Could the presence of a stranger begin to erase the man she had once loved? The man whose violence had almost destroyed her? Guilt gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. She would find herself almost smiling at something, the way Eli coaxed a stubborn post into the ground, or the sight of his broad back as he worked against the setting sun, and she would immediately recoil, hating herself for the lapse. She was the canyon widow. She was meant to be haunted. She was not meant to feel peace. One afternoon, the rhythm was broken. A cry, thin and pained, carried on the wind. Eli stopped his work, his head coming up, listening. Clara came to the cabin door. In the distance, near the creek bed, they saw it. A horse, a beautiful buckskin mare, was down on its side, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle. It was struggling weakly, its sides heaving. Without a word, they both started running. They reached the animal together. Its eyes were wide with pain and fear, and a deep, ugly gash ran along its flank, crawling with flies. It looked like it had taken a bad fall among the rocks. "She's broken her leg," Clara said, her voice filled with a pained sympathy she rarely allowed herself to feel for anything anymore. "We have to put her out of her misery." Eli knelt, running a gentle hand along the mare's trembling neck, his touch surprisingly soothing. He examined the leg, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's not a clean break. It's a bad sprain, maybe a fracture, but it can be set." He looked up at her, his expression serious. "But we have to get her on her feet. If she stays down too long, her own weight will kill her. I'll need your help." For the next few hours, they worked side by side. The horse was a creature of pure, terrified instinct, and every touch risked a panicked kick. But Eli spoke to it in a low, constant murmur, a stream of nonsense and reassurance that seemed to calm the animal. He showed Clara how to clean the gash on its flank, his large hands guiding hers as she washed the wound with water she brought from the creek. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt went through her, a startling spark of warmth in the cold landscape of her life. Together, they fashioned a splint from a fallen branch and strips of cloth torn from one of Clara's old aprons. The hardest part was getting the mare to its feet. They heaved and pushed, their bodies straining together, their breathing harsh in the quiet afternoon. Finally, with a great, shuddering effort, the horse staggered upright, leaning heavily against Eli. It stood, trembling, but it stood. From a ridge a quarter of a mile away, Silas Croft, a sour-faced farmer whose land bordered Clara's, watched the scene through a pair of old field glasses. He saw the drifter and the widow working together, their heads bent close, their hands touching. He saw the intimacy of their shared struggle, and his small, suspicious mind twisted it into something ugly, something that would make for a fine piece of gossip the next time he was in town. That evening, a bone-deep exhaustion settled over them. The horse was tethered near the cabin, hobbled and calm, munching on a handful of grass Clara had gathered. They sat on the small, rickety porch, not speaking, watching as the stars began to prick the deep indigo sky. The shared work, the small victory of saving a life, had forged a new kind of silence between them, one that was not empty, but full. Clara felt something inside her break. It was not a loud, shattering thing, but a quiet, painful crack. She had spent so long holding everything in, building walls of silence to protect herself. But the kindness of this stranger, the simple, shared purpose of the afternoon, had worn away at the stones. A single tear tracked its way through the dust on her cheek, then another. Soon, she was crying, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Eli did not move. He did not touch her or offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat there, a solid, unwavering presence beside her in the twilight, letting her grief have its space. When the tears finally subsided, leaving her hollowed out and raw, she spoke, her voice a ragged whisper aimed at the darkness. "They all think he was such a good man." She did not have to say who she meant. They talk about him in town like he was a saint. Strong, hard-working Nathan Langley. She took a shuddering breath. He wasn't who they thought he was. It was a small confession, a single stone pulled from the mountain of her secret, but it felt like it had taken all the strength she had left. She waited for him to question her, to pry, to judge. Instead, Eli turned his head and looked at her, his face shadowed by the dying light. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and certain, a bedrock of truth in her swirling world of lies and fear. "I don't care what they say," he said. "I care what I see." And in the darkness of the porch, Clara felt that for the first time in a very long time. Someone was finally seeing her. Not the cursed widow, not the mad woman, not the sinner, just a woman, wounded and broken, who was still, somehow, alive. And for the first time, that felt less like a punishment and more like a possibility. The fragile peace that had settled over Clara's land was as thin as morning mist, and just as quick to burn away. The rumors Silas Croft had planted in Jericho Springs took root in fertile soil, and the town's suspicion hardened into something colder and more dangerous. Eli felt it when he rode in for supplies a week after they had saved the mare. The whispers no longer followed him. They preceded him. The air in Gable's mercantile was thick with a silence that was louder than any accusation. This time, they were waiting for him. As he left the store, 3 men blocked his path. Mr. Gable, his storekeeper's apron still on. The blacksmith, a barrel-chested man named Finch, with soot permanently etched into the lines of his face. And the town's preacher, Reverend Miller, a tall, gaunt man whose eyes held the conviction of a hanging judge. "Mr. McCrae," the Reverend began, his voice smooth and polished as a river stone. "We find ourselves concerned." Eli stood motionless, the weight of the supply sack a familiar burden in his hand. He said nothing, his gaze level, his face a mask of stone. "A man of your background," Miller continued, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "Associating with a woman of her fragility, it does not sit well with the decent folk of this community. It invites trouble." "The woman needed help," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "Help is one thing," Gable interjected, stepping forward. "Taking up residence is another. People are talking. It is an unseemly situation." Finch, the blacksmith, folded his thick arms. "What we're saying is this," he said, his voice a blunt instrument. "You're a stranger here. You don't know the currents of this place. That Langley woman, she lives on the edge of the canyon for a reason. And you, friend, are getting too close to the canyon." The threat was unmistakable, as cold and sharp as a knife's edge. The canyon, the place of death, the place they had already assigned to Clara, and now, to him. Eli's eyes, hard as slate, moved from one man's face to the next. He saw no compassion, no Christian charity in the preacher's eyes, only a grim satisfaction. He saw fear in Gables, and a brutish hostility in the blacksmiths. They were a pack, united in their judgment, and they had marked Clara as a blight to be contained or cut away. A muscle tightened in Eli's jaw. He shifted the weight of the supplies in his arm and took a single, deliberate step forward, forcing the men to give way. He paused beside the Reverend, his voice so low only Miller could hear it. "You'd do well to spend more time praying for your own soul, preacher, and less time worrying about hers." He walked to his horse, mounted, and rode out of town without a backward glance, the force of their collective hatred a palpable thing on his back. He was quiet when he returned, his silence a heavy, brooding thing that filled the small cabin. Clara watched him as he put away the supplies, his movements tight with a contained anger. She saw the new tension in his shoulders, the hard line of his mouth. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that his trip to town had been about her. The world she had hidden from was now coming for him, because of her. The thought was unbearable. Her secret was no longer just her own burden. It was a danger to the only person who had shown her kindness. That evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, they sat on the porch. The rescued mare, now strong on its splinted leg, grazed peacefully nearby, a testament to their shared efforts. But the peace it represented felt a world away. "They said something to you," Clara said, her voice barely audible. It was not a question. Eli stared out at the vast, darkening plains, his face a landscape of shadows. "They're worried about my soul," he said, a bitter irony lacing his tone. "Because of me." He did not deny it. The truth lay between them, stark and unavoidable. She felt a familiar, cold dread seep into her bones. She had tried to carry the weight of that final night alone, to protect the memory of her husband, to absorb the town's scorn as her penance. But she saw now that her silence was a different kind of poison, one that was beginning to seep out and taint him, too. He deserved to know what kind of trouble he was truly inviting. "Eli," she began, her hands twisting in her lap until her knuckles were white. "What I told you before, about Nathan, it was not all of it." He turned to look at her, his expression patient, waiting. He did not press. He simply waited for her to find the words. "They think Nathan was a good man," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the splintered floorboards of the porch. "He was, once, before the ranch started failing. Before the drink." Her voice trembled. "The drink made him mean. At first, it was just words. Sharp, ugly words that cut you where you couldn't see the wound." She took a shuddering breath, the memories she had kept locked away for so long beginning to stir in their dark corners. Then it was more. A shove, a grab that left a bruise on my arm. "He was always sorry the next morning. So sorry. He would weep and tell me how much he loved me, how he didn't know what came over him." She looked up at Eli, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "And I believed him. Every time. I thought my love could fix him. I thought if I was just a better wife, a better woman, the man I married would come back." She fell silent, the shame of it a physical weight in her chest, the shame of being a victim, of staying, of hoping when there was no hope left. "The night he died," she continued, her voice dropping to a near inaudible rasp. "There was a storm, like the one you found me in. He had been in town, drinking all day. He came home in a rage. He said I had been with another man. He said he saw me talking to Mr. Finch in town, that I was smiling at him. It was madness. He started breaking things. He threw a plate, and it shattered right by my head." The terror of that night was fresh again, a cold sweat on her skin. "He grabbed me. He said he was going to cleanse my sins. He dragged me out into the storm, toward the canyon. He was screaming that he was going to make me fly. He was going to throw me in. He was going to kill me. Eli." The confession was out, a raw, ugly thing laid bare in the twilight. "I fought him. I twisted away and tried to run, but the rock was so slippery. He lunged for me, and he caught my arm. But his feet, his boots, went out from under him. He slipped. She looked directly at him now, her gaze desperate, pleading for him to understand. He let go of me to try and catch his balance, but there was nothing to hold on to. He just fell. I never told anyone the truth. They loved him. I was the strange girl from out of town he had married. Who would believe me? Who would believe the word of a hysterical widow over that of a man they all respected? She finished, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She had finally spoken the unspeakable, and she waited for the verdict, for the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the subtle recoil of disbelief. Eli did not move for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of her choked breaths and the chirping of the crickets. Then he reached out, his calloused hand covering hers. His touch was warm and firm, an anchor in the storm of her memory. "I believe you, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. There was no pity in it, only a deep, unwavering certainty that settled in the deepest parts of her soul. The two simple words were a key turning a lock that had been rusted shut for years. The relief that washed over her was so profound it was painful. The dam broke, and the tears she had held back for so long came in a hot, cleansing flood. He did not pull away. He just sat there, his hand covering hers, letting her cry until the grief and fear had been wept out of her. When she was quiet again, a fragile calm settling over her, he gently used his thumb to wipe a stray tear from her cheek. She looked up at him, her blue eyes shimmering in the faint moonlight. She saw in his gaze a reflection of her own pain, a history of loss that he did not have to speak for her to understand. They were two solitary souls, branded by their pasts, who had somehow found each other on the edge of the same wilderness. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She leaned toward him, a small, hesitant motion. Their first kiss was not one of passion, but of profound recognition. It was as gentle as a breath, a soft meeting of lips that tasted of salt and sorrow. It was a promise in the dark, a raw, slow-burning moment of connection in the middle of a life in ruins. It was fragile, tentative, and more real than anything she had ever known. In that single, quiet moment, she felt a flicker of healing, the first stitch in a wound she thought would never close. The spell was shattered by a sudden, unnatural orange glow that danced against the side of the cabin. A moment later, the smell hit them, acrid smoke, sharp and hot. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of grim fury. He ran around the corner of the cabin, and Clara followed, her heart seizing in her chest. The small barn, the one he had just finished repairing the roof on, was engulfed in flames. Fire licked up the dry timber walls, roaring toward the night sky. A hungry, malevolent beast. Arson. This was their answer, the town's final warning. "Stay back!" Eli yelled, grabbing 2 empty buckets from beside the rain barrel. He sprinted toward the creek, a dark figure silhouetted against the terrible light. Clara stood frozen, her hand flying to her mouth. A strangled sob escaped her. The crackle of the flames, the heat on her face, the sight of her world being consumed by fire. It was all happening again. Every moment of hope she had ever dared to feel was punished with destruction. The farm she had shared with Nathan, her child, her life, all taken by fire and death. And now this. A wave of despair so powerful it buckled her knees washed over her, and she sank to the ground, weeping, the terrible, helpless sobs of someone who was losing everything all over again. Eli fought with a desperate, silent fury, throwing bucket after bucket of water onto the blaze. But it was a futile effort. The fire had too strong a hold. He could only work to keep it from spreading to the cabin. An hour later, it was over. The barn was a skeletal ruin of blackened, smoldering timbers, hissing as a light rain began to fall. He walked back to where Clara was huddled on the ground, his face and arms black with soot, his clothes soaked. He knelt in front of her, his eyes searching her face in the grim, flickering light of the embers. He saw the utter devastation in her expression, the vacant stare of someone who had retreated deep inside herself, to a place where nothing else could hurt her. His jaw tightened. "It's not safe here," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and smoke. "You can't stay here tonight." She did not seem to hear him. Gently, he took her by the arms and pulled her to her feet. She was pliant, her body trembling without cease. He led her away from the ruin of her home, toward his horse. He lifted her into the saddle, then mounted behind her, his arms a protective circle around her. He took her to the old McCrae homestead. It was a few miles away. A small, sturdy cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, a place he had not yet had the heart to reclaim. It was filled with the ghosts of his own family, but tonight it was a sanctuary. He carried her inside, into the dusty, silent space, and laid her on a cot covered with an old canvas tarp. He built a fire in the hearth, the familiar motions steadying his own shaking hands. He did not try to talk to her. He simply pulled a chair close to the cot and sat down, a silent, watchful guardian. He spent the night there, watching her as she drifted in and out of a shallow, troubled sleep, his presence a solid wall between her and the nightmares that waited in the dark. For the first time since Nathan had died, Clara was not alone with her ghosts, and in the profound, exhausted silence of the stranger's cabin, wrapped in the warmth of the fire, she felt a sliver of safety so deep and so unfamiliar that it felt almost like hope. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee. Eli was standing by the hearth, his back to her. The pale light of dawn streamed through the dirty window pane. "They will not drive us out," he said, without turning around. His voice was quiet, but it held the unyielding strength of stone. "I'm going to start rebuilding today." Clara sat up, pushing the tangled hair from her face. She looked at her hands, raw and scraped from the night before. She thought of the fire, the hatred, the endless cycle of loss. She could surrender to it. She could let the canyon claim her, let the town's judgment be her final epitaph. Or she could fight. "I'll help," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper, but it was the strongest she had ever felt. Later that day, they stood in the blackened, wet ruins of her barn. The work was grueling. They pulled away charred timbers, their hands and faces quickly covered in soot. The air was thick with the stench of wet ash. Clara's hands, accustomed to little more than gardening, were quickly rubbed raw. Blisters formed on her palms, and then broke. But she did not stop. The sharp, physical pain was a relief. It was a clean pain, an honest pain, with every ruined board she carried. She felt as if she were carrying away a piece of her own past, making room for something new to be built in its place. She worked alongside Eli, their movements falling into a shared rhythm, two solitary figures starting over in the ashes. Their shared purpose a small, defiant flame against the encroaching darkness. The rhythm of rebuilding was a harsh but honest meditation. Each swing of the hammer, each saw cut through fresh pine, was a strike against the past. Clara worked alongside Eli. Her hands, once soft, now bore the calloused, blistered proof of her labor. The sun baked the sorrow from her skin, and the ache in her muscles at the end of each day was a clean, grounding pain. For the first time in months, she was not just surviving, she was building a fragile hope, as new and raw as the timber frame of the rising barn, began to take root in the wasteland of her heart. This delicate peace was shattered by the arrival of a horseman. He was not one of the scowling faces from Jericho Springs. This man wore a dusty coat and a tin star on his vest. He moved with a quiet authority that was more unsettling than any threat the town council could muster. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat to Clara as he dismounted. "Mr. McCrae, my name is Deputy Miller. I'm out of Laramie County." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Laramie. Not their town. This was something else. Something official. "We're a bit busy here. Deputy," Eli said, stepping slightly in front of Clara, his stance casual but protective. His hand rested near the hammer on his tool belt. "I'm sure you are," the deputy said, his eyes taking in the half-built barn, then settling on Clara. "I'm here about your husband, Mrs. Langley, Nathan Langley." The name was a blow, knocking the wind from her. "That was over 7 months ago," she managed, her voice a reedy whisper. "Yes, ma'am, but a report was filed in my county around that time. A traveler, a fur trapper, was passing through. He reported seeing a man and a woman arguing something fierce out here, by the canyon, during a bad storm. Said it looked ugly. He reported it when he got to Laramie, but with no names. There wasn't much to do. The report just sat." The deputy paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Then my sheriff gets to hearing about the fire out here and about all the talk in Jericho Springs. It made him curious enough to send me out to have a look." Clara's hands began to tremble. A witness. There had been a witness. Her carefully guarded secret, her terrible, complicated truth, was about to be torn open for the world to see. All they would see was the argument. They would see a wife and her husband, and then a dead husband. The conclusion was simple, brutal, and wrong. "What kind of questions do you have?" Eli asked, his voice steady, pulling the deputy's attention away from Clara's panicked face. The deputy asked about the night Nathan died, about their marriage, about the fire. Eli answered for her when he could, his answers brief and non-committal. Clara could only nod or shake her head, her throat too tight for words. The deputy made notes in a small book, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said finally, tucking the book away. "That's all for now. I'll be staying in Jericho Springs for a day or two. Asking around. I may be back." He mounted his horse, gave them a final, lingering look, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in his wake. The moment he was gone, Clara's composure crumbled. "They're going to arrest me," she gasped, staggering back against a stack of new lumber. "They'll say I pushed him. They'll hang me. Eli—" She was spiraling, the black terror of the canyon's edge wrapping around her once more. Eli was there in an instant, his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "No one is hanging you," he said, his voice a low, firm anchor in her storm. "Listen to me. Clara, the truth. It's all you've got, and it's all you need. If that deputy comes back, if it comes to it, you look him in the eye and you tell him everything, exactly as you told me." "He won't believe me," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "No one will." "I believe you," he said, his grip tightening slightly, his gaze unwavering. "That's a start. And if you have to tell your story, you will not be standing there alone. I will be right beside you. I swear it." That night, sleep was an impossibility. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind, sounded like the footsteps of the deputy coming to take her away. She rose from her cot in Eli's cabin, where she had been staying since the fire, and found an old, leather-bound journal and a pencil stub in a crate of his family's forgotten belongings. By the faint light of the moon, she opened it to a clean page and began to write. "To a friend I do not have. The law came today. He had a kind face, but his questions were like stones, each one heavier than the last. There was a witness. Someone saw the anger, but not the fear. They saw the fight, but not the fall. How can I explain the truth of that night when I can barely stand to hold it in my own mind? Eli says I must. He says he will stand with me. I do not understand him. He looks at me and does not see a murderer or a curse. He sees me. The terror of that is almost as great as the comfort. To be seen is to be vulnerable, and I do not know if I have the strength for it. I fear that when they come for me, he will be dragged down into the canyon right alongside me, The act of writing, of giving form to the chaos in her mind, was a small release. It did not banish the fear, but it contained it. The next afternoon, another visitor arrived. Reverend Miller, his black coat a stark blot against the landscape, approached the work site with a Bible clutched in his hand. Mrs. Langley, he said, his voice oozing a false sympathy. I heard the law was here. I have come to offer you counsel. It is never too late to unburden your soul. Confession is the first step toward God's forgiveness. I have nothing to confess to you, Reverend, Clara said, her voice colder than she thought possible. The Lord knows the truth of a sinner's heart, he pressed on, his eyes glittering with a righteous fire. He knows the path of wickedness. He saw the fire that cleansed your barn, and he sees the new sin you cultivate here with this man, living under his roof. It is a path that leads only to damnation, for both of you. Before Clara could respond, Eli was there, moving with a silent speed that was unnerving. He put himself between Clara and the preacher, his broad back a solid wall. She told you she has nothing to say to you, Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. The preacher drew himself up, offended. I am speaking to one of my flock, a lost sheep I intend to guide back. She's not your flock. Eli cut him off. And you are no shepherd. You're a vulture, circling, waiting for something to die. Get off this land. You dare threaten a man of God? Miller sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. I'm telling a man to leave a woman in peace, Eli said, taking a step forward. The two men were nearly chest to chest, the air crackling with imminent violence. The preacher, for all his moral authority, was a man of words, and he recognized in Eli a man of action. He took a nervous step back, his pious mask slipping to reveal the coward beneath. You will regret this, he hissed. God will not be mocked. He will see you both cast into the pit. He turned and stalked away, his dignity in tatters. The confrontation left the air charged and heavy. As soon as the preacher was out of sight, Clara turned on Eli, her fear and frustration boiling over into a desperate anger. "Shh, you see?" she cried, her voice shaking. "This is what I was talking about. You cannot fight the whole town for me. Eli, for your own safety, you have to leave. Let me face this alone. It is my trouble, not yours." "It became my trouble when they set fire to your barn," he shot back, his own temper flaring. "It became my trouble when that preacher came here to spit his venom at you. Am I supposed to just ride away and let them tear you to pieces?" "Yes," she screamed, tears welling in her eyes. "If it keeps you safe, yes. I cannot be the reason you are destroyed. I will not have another man's ruin on my hands." The words hung in the air, raw and painful. He strode toward her, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, and grabbed her by the arms. His grip was hard, insistent, not cruel but desperate. "This is my choice, Clara, mine," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Stop trying to protect me from a fight I'm already in." The intensity of his gaze, the heat of his hands on her arms, the sheer, stubborn force of his will, it overwhelmed her. All her fear, all her anger, all her desperate, unspoken longing collapsed into a single, shuddering moment. The space between them vanished, charged with a current that had been simmering for weeks. He lowered his head, and she lifted hers, and their mouths met in a kiss that was nothing like the first. It was fierce, hungry, a collision of desperation and need. In the dizzying chaos, as she clung to him, a single, terrified plea escaped her lips, gasped against his. "Don't let me fall alone." He swept her up into his arms and carried her into his cabin, kicking the door shut behind them. He laid her on the cot, his body covering hers, and in the dusty afternoon light, they finally fell. It was not a gentle coming together. It was a desperate, frantic act of claiming and being claimed. It was charged with the pain of their pasts and the uncertainty of their future. A raw and beautiful collision of two lonely souls finding a moment of searing, absolute connection in the heart of the storm. For the first time, Clara did not feel like she was falling into a canyon of loss, but into the arms of the one person who was willing to fall with her. The next morning, she woke to the soft gray light of dawn. The cot was empty beside her. A profound vulnerability washed over her, followed by a tender, unfamiliar warmth. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her naked shoulders, and listened. She heard a faint scratching sound from the main room, and then Eli's low voice, speaking softly to himself as he wrote. Curiosity piqued. She crept to the doorway and peered through the crack. He was at the small, rough table, a pen in his hand, a single sheet of paper in front of him. His brow was furrowed in concentration. "No, it has been too long," he murmured, his voice raspy in the morning quiet. "But I have to make things right. I think it's time I leave this place behind for good." Clara's heart stopped. "Leave this place. Start a new life," he continued, his pen scratching. "Away from all this pain, away from the ghosts." Her blood ran cold. He was leaving, after everything, after last night. "It's time I came home. Sarah." Sarah. The name was a blade that sliced through the fragile, hopeful thing that had begun to grow inside her. Of course there was a Sarah, a woman he was going home to, a woman who was not her. He had gotten what he wanted, and now he was making his plans to leave. The kindness, the protection, the passion, it had all been a lie, a temporary comfort before he returned to his real life. The pain was so sharp, so instant, it stole her breath. It confirmed her deepest, most hidden belief. She was not worthy of being stayed for. Anyone who got close would eventually leave her behind. The walls she had allowed to crumble slammed back into place, higher and stronger than ever. When he finally came back into the room, a small, hopeful smile on his face, he did not find the woman he had held through the night. He found the canyon widow. Her eyes were chips of ice, her body rigid beneath the blanket. "You should get dressed," she said, her voice flat and empty. "You have plans to make—" He stopped, his smile faltering, utterly baffled by the sudden frost. "Clara, what's wrong?" She finally looked at him, and her gaze was filled with a familiar, bleak desolation that he had not seen since the day he pulled her from the storm. "Nothing is wrong," she said, the words cutting like glass. "I was just reminding myself of the truth. In the end, everyone falls alone." She pushed him away, not with her hands, but with a coldness so absolute it was like a physical blow, leaving him standing alone in the ruins of a connection he had just begun to believe in. The coldness that had enveloped Clara was a familiar armor, a shield of ice forged in years of pain. Eli's words, about his brother, about a woman named Sarah, were meaningless sounds, muffled by the roaring in her ears, the deafening echo of her own deepest fears being proven true. Betrayal was a language she understood perfectly. "Clara, please, just listen," he pleaded, his voice raw with a confusion she refused to acknowledge. "Sarah is my brother's widow. I was writing to her to—" "It does not matter," she cut him off, her voice devoid of all emotion. She moved with a stiff, jerky economy, pulling on her dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. "You have your plans. You are leaving. That is all I need to understand." "I am not leaving you." His shout was a physical blow, but she did not flinch. She was already numb. She turned to face him, her eyes as empty and gray as a winter sky. "Men like you always leave," she said, the words a quiet, devastating finality. She walked out of his cabin without another word, ignoring the sound of her name being called out in a desperate, broken cry. She did not go back to the ruins of her barn. Her feet, acting on a grim instinct older than thought, carried her toward the one place that held the truth of her life. She walked toward the canyon. The landscape blurred around her, her mind a maelstrom of faces and voices. Nathan's drunken sneer twisted into Eli's earnest, pleading face. The memory of a violent shove blended with the memory of a gentle hand. It was all one and the same, a cycle of hope and destruction that had finally, mercifully, come to an end. There was no more hope left to be destroyed. The sky, which had been a clear, cool blue, began to curdle. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, their bellies a bruised purple. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that rose to a familiar, hungry howl. Clara did not notice. She reached the ledge, the exact spot, the slab of rock where her life had irrevocably broken, and she stopped, staring down into the vast, empty throat of the chasm. Eli found her there minutes later. He had followed at a distance, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He saw her standing perilously close to the edge, a small, solitary figure against the backdrop of the oncoming storm. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall. "Clara!" he yelled over the rising wind. "Come away from there! We need to talk!" The storm broke with the sudden violence of a gunshot. The sky opened up, and the world dissolved into a gray, roaring chaos of wind and water. It was the same storm, the same place. Time had collapsed, and she was trapped in the nightmare once more. She turned to face him, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wild with a grief that bordered on madness. "There is nothing to talk about," she screamed, her words nearly torn from her lips by the gale. "Go home to Sarah. Go have your new life and leave me to the ghosts." "The letter is not what you think," he shouted back, taking a careful step toward her on the slick, treacherous rock. "It does not matter what I think," she cried, taking a reflexive step backward. Her heel came down on a patch of wet, slick moss. Her feet shot out from under her. A strangled cry of pure, animal terror was ripped from her throat as her body pitched backward over the edge of the canyon. Time slowed to a crawl. In that horrifying, suspended moment, Eli lunged. He threw himself forward onto the muddy ground, his arms shooting out, his fingers closing around her wrist in a desperate, burning grip just as her full weight went over the side. The force nearly pulled him over with her. His boots scrabbled for purchase, his muscles screaming in protest as he held on, the tendons in his arm feeling as if they might snap. Below him, she dangled, a terrifying void of rushing wind and rock beneath her. The rain blinded him. The thunder cracked like the sky breaking apart, and all he could feel was the terrifying, fragile connection of his hand to her wrist. She looked up at him, her face a white mask of shock in the flashes of lightning. Then the shock gave way to a terrible, hollow resignation. Sobs tore from her, a sound of utter brokenness. "Let me go!" she screamed, her voice a raw plea against the storm's fury. "Please, Eli, just let me go. I don't want to be saved again just to be left." Her words cut through him, sharper than any blade. He finally understood. It was not death she feared. It was the agony of a rescuer who walks away. It was the pain of being pulled from the water only to be left to die of exposure on the shore. "I am not leaving you," he roared back, his voice a primal promise against the thunder. He shifted his weight, digging his boots deeper into the mud, his knuckles white with the strain. "I will not let you fall alone. If you fall, we fall together. So fall with me. Clara, not alone." His words, a crazy, desperate oath shouted into the abyss, seemed to shock her out of her despair. Her eyes widened, and in that moment, with all his strength, he began to pull. It was a brutal, agonizing process. He hauled her upward, her body scraping against the sharp rock face, her dead weight an almost impossible burden. He grunted with the effort, his vision tunneling, his world shrinking to that single point of contact. Finally, with one last desperate heave, he pulled her over the ledge. They collapsed together in the mud, a tangled heap of soaked limbs, gasping for breath. She lay on top of him, her face buried in his chest, her body racked with tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. He held her tight, his arms wrapped around her like steel bands, as if he feared the canyon might still try to reclaim her. They stayed like that for a long time, two survivors clinging to each other on the edge of the world while the storm raged around them. The journey back to his cabin was a silent, stumbling ordeal. They moved as one, leaning on each other, their bodies shaking with cold and the violent aftermath of adrenaline. Inside, Eli barred the door against the storm and immediately set about building a roaring fire in the hearth. The silence was thick with everything that had happened, with everything that had almost happened. Clara sank onto the floor before the fire, wrapping a dry blanket around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the flames. Eli said nothing. He walked to the small table, picked up the single, slightly crumpled sheet of paper, and came to kneel in front of her. He did not try to explain, not with his own flawed words. He simply held out the letter. "Read it," he said, his voice hoarse and quiet. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely take it from him. She angled it toward the firelight, her eyes scanning the neat, careful script. "Sarah, I am writing this because I owe you and Thomas that much. For 10 years, I have let his ghost haunt me. I ran from that battlefield, and I have been running ever since, living a half-life, believing I did not deserve anything more. I carried my guilt like a shroud, and I let it poison everything I was. I came back here thinking I would face the past, but I did not know how. Something has changed. I have met someone. Her name is Clara. She has ghosts of her own, more than any one person should have to carry, but in her, I have seen a strength I did not think was possible, and in trying to help her stand, I have found my own feet again. I am telling you this because I need to finally let Thomas go. I need to forgive myself, not so I can forget him, but so I can finally live. The man who ran from that battle is gone. I am leaving that part of myself behind for good, here in this place, full of our family's memories. I want to start a new life, away from all this pain. With her. I am not coming home. Sarah, I am finally ready to build one. I hope you can find it in your heart to understand. Yours, Eli." The letter fell from her fingers. The words swam in her vision, blurring through a sudden, hot rush of tears. Sarah was not his future. She was the past he was finally letting go of. He was not planning on leaving her. He was planning on staying, on building a life from the ashes of both of their pasts. The magnitude of her mistake, of her doubt, was a crushing weight. She looked up at him, her face a canvas of shame and a dawning, radiant relief. The tears that fell now were not of despair, but of a release so profound it felt like a rebirth. He had not just saved her from the canyon. He had shown her that he was willing to stand in it with her. The next day dawned bright and clear, the world washed clean. A new resolve had settled in Clara's heart. She was done hiding. She was done letting the whispers of others write her story. She told Eli what she had to do, and he simply nodded, his eyes full of a quiet, steady pride. "I'll be right there," he said. It was Sunday. Most of the townsfolk of Jericho Springs were gathered in the dusty clearing in front of the small, clapboard church for the weekly social before the service. It was the heart of the community, the central stage for all its judgments and pronouncements. Deputy Miller was there, his horse tied to the hitching post, making his final inquiries before heading back to Laramie. A hush fell over the crowd as Clara and Eli walked into the clearing. They parted like the sea, murmurs and hostile glares following them. Clara did not falter, with Eli a solid, silent presence a step behind her. She walked to the church steps and turned to face them all. "I know what you all say about me," she began, her voice clear and strong, carrying in the still morning air. "I know what you believe happened to my husband, Nathan, and you deserve to know the truth." She told them everything. She spoke of Nathan's kindness before the drink took hold, and the darkness that followed. She spoke of his anger, of the bruises she hid, of the fear she lived with every single day. Her voice did not shake. She spoke with the simple, unadorned power of the truth. "The night he died, he was not himself," she said, her gaze sweeping over their stunned faces. "He was drunk, and he was violent, and he tried to throw me into the canyon. I ran from him, and in his rage, he slipped on the wet rock. It was an accident, a terrible, tragic accident, but I did not push him. I was his victim, not his killer." She took a deep breath. "I stayed silent because I was afraid. I was ashamed, and I did not think any of you would believe me. I see now that my silence was a mistake. It allowed a lie to grow in the dark. But I will not be silent anymore." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Reverend Miller's face was a mask of thunderous indignation. "Mrs." Gable scoffed loudly. But among the crowd, several of the women looked away. Unable to meet Clara's gaze, a few exchanged quiet, knowing glances, looks of shared, unspoken understanding. They had seen the darkness in their own homes, in their own lives, and they recognized the ring of truth in Clara's words. Deputy Miller stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. He had heard the whispers and the rumors, but now he had heard the testimony, delivered publicly, without flinching. He looked at Clara's face, etched with a sorrow that was too real to be faked, and he looked at the quiet, unwavering man standing beside her. "This town has seen enough tragedy," the deputy announced, his voice carrying an official finality. "This was a private matter that ended in a terrible accident. As far as the law is concerned, the death of Nathan Langley is a closed case. There will be no charges." He tipped his hat to Clara, a small gesture of respect, mounted his horse, and rode out of town, taking the last of the legal threats with him. In the quiet aftermath, as the crowd began to disperse into unsettled, murmuring groups, Eli turned to Clara. Her ordeal was over, but the ruins of her life here remained. "There is nothing left for you here, Clara," he said gently, his voice full of a quiet hope. "This place will only ever be a reminder. We could go west, maybe, find some land, start over, with no ghost to follow us." He took her hand. "Come with me." She looked at his face, at the open, honest future he was offering her. Then her gaze drifted past him, to the harsh, familiar lines of the canyon in the distance, to the town that had scorned her, to the land that had taken everything from her. The fear was still there, a faint echo in her heart, but for the first time, the hope was stronger. The choice, finally, was hers. The choice, once made, settled in Clara's soul with the quiet weight of a stone finding the bottom of a still lake. For the first time, she was not reacting to her fate, but choosing it. The next morning, while Eli began the arduous task of repairing his family's long-abandoned wagon, Clara knew there was one last ghost she had to face alone. She walked to the small, wind-swept cemetery behind the church. The town was quiet, its inhabitants keeping to themselves, nursing the shock of her public confession. The air was no longer thick with open hostility, but with a sullen, unsettled silence that was a kind of peace. Nathan's grave was marked by a simple wooden cross, the letters of his name already beginning to fade under the relentless sun. The earth was still mounded, a raw wound on the prairie. She stood before it, not with the terror or the guilt that had haunted her for so long, but with a strange, sad clarity. She remembered the boy he had been, the one who had charmed her with his easy laugh and bold promises. She remembered the man he had become, his spirit corroded by failure and drink, his love twisting into a cruel and possessive thing. He was not a monster, not a saint. He was just a man, broken and lost, who had tried to break her too. Her fingers went to the thin gold band on her left hand. It had been years since she had been able to remove it, her knuckles having swollen slightly. With a determined twist, she worked it over her joint. It came free with a surprising ease. She held the ring in her palm, its perfect, unbroken circle a lie. It was a symbol of a promise that had become a cage. It had bound her to him in life, and its memory had bound her to this place in his death. She did not throw it. She did not bury it. She simply leaned forward and gently placed the ring on the rough, splintered wood of the cross, letting it hang on a nail. The sun glinted off the gold, a final, faint flicker of a life that was now truly over. "You cannot hurt me anymore," she whispered. The words not for him, but for herself. A declaration of independence, a promise of a future he could not touch. She turned and walked away, her steps light, leaving the ghost of Nathan Langley behind her, a lonely sentinel in a field of silent stones. She returned to find Eli wrestling with a broken wheel, his brow furrowed in concentration. The wagon was a skeleton of its former self, a relic of a past life, much like the two of them. But the wood of the frame was solid oak, and the iron fittings, though rusted, were strong. It could be rebuilt, it could be made new again. "Let me help," she said, and for the next several days, they worked. Their life fell into a new rhythm, one of purpose and partnership. Eli, with his patient, skilled hands, replaced the rotted planks of the wagon bed, his saw and hammer echoing in the quiet valley. Clara, with a fierce determination, took on the tasks she could manage. She scrubbed the grime of years from the canvas cover, stitched the tears with a steady hand, and treated the cracked leather of the harnesses with oil until they were supple and strong again. They spoke little, but their silence was a comfortable, shared thing. It was the silence of two people who understood each other without the need for words. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, eating a simple meal of bacon and bread, and talk of the future. Their plans were not grand dreams, but small, practical hopes. A patch of land with good water, a small, sturdy cabin, a garden where she could grow vegetables and he could raise a few head of cattle. They were building a life together, board by board, stitch by stitch. They had nothing, a few tools, 2 good horses, a handful of supplies, and the clothes on their backs. But as Clara watched Eli plane a rough piece of lumber into a smooth, perfect plank, she knew they had everything that mattered. They had each other. For their final supply run, they had to go back into Jericho Springs. They needed salt, coffee, and a few lengths of rope, essentials for a long journey into the unknown. Clara felt a flicker of the old apprehension as they walked toward Gable's mercantile, but she pushed it down. She would not be a frightened mouse in this town ever again. The store was empty save for Mrs. Gable, who served them with a cold, tight-lipped efficiency, and 2 other women. One was Abigail Finch, the blacksmith's sister, a woman with a perpetually sour face and eyes that held a special venom for Clara. Her brother had been one of Nathan's drinking partners and had made clumsy, hopeful advances toward Clara before her husband's death had turned her into a pariah. Well, Abigail said, her voice loud and sharp enough to cut glass. "Look what the coyotes dragged in, the Black Widow herself. Come to pick the bones clean before she flies off." Clara stopped and turned, her bag of coffee held loosely in her hand. Eli tensed beside her, ready to step in, but she gave him a subtle shake of her head. This was her battle. "I suppose you think you got away with it all," Abigail sneered, stepping closer, emboldened by Clara's silence. "First you drive a good man to his death, and now you've charmed this drifter into carrying you off. You are a poison in this town. Clara Langley, a curse on any man foolish enough to look your way." The old Clara would have withered under the attack. She would have fled, her face burning with shame, the cruel words chasing her back into her hole. But the woman who stood in the store now was not the old Clara. She was a woman who had faced down her own ghosts in a storm on the edge of the world. A town gossip held no terror for her. She met Abigail's hateful glare with a look of calm, unwavering pity. She did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself. "I am sorry you feel such bitterness. Abigail, she said, her voice even and clear, my life has known its share of sorrow, as I am sure yours has. I wish you nothing but peace. The simple, dignified response completely disarmed her attacker. Abigail was left sputtering, her face flushed with a frustrated rage. There was no sport in tormenting someone who refused to be tormented. Clara turned, placed her coins on the counter for Mrs. Gable, and walked out of the store with her head held high. Eli fell into step beside her, a look of quiet, profound admiration on his face. She had not needed him to fight for her. She had fought for herself, not with fists or fury, but with a strength that her tormentor could not comprehend. That night, their last night, they did not stay in the cabin. They took 2 blankets and walked to the canyon ridge as the sun began to set. They sat on the very edge of the world, the place of her greatest terror, and watched as the sky put on a final, breathtaking show of color. The canyon below was not a hungry mouth, but a place of deep, shadowed beauty. They had reclaimed it. It was no longer a place of death, but the place where their new life had truly begun. The stars emerged, a brilliant, silent scattering of diamonds on black velvet. A cool breeze whispered up from the depths, carrying the scent of sage and clean, dry rock. Clara shivered, though not from the cold. She was trembling with the enormity of it all, the past she was leaving, the future she was stepping into. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. She turned to Eli, her hand coming to rest on the solid, warm wall of his chest. She could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her palm. "You caught me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she looked into his eyes. "And I'm still falling." He understood. He pulled her close, wrapping her in the circle of his arms, his embrace a silent answer. He was not just the man who had caught her. He was the man who was falling with her, into a future they would build together. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The wagon stood ready, a small, sturdy vessel for their hopes. They mounted the seat, Eli taking the reins, Clara beside him. They did not look back at the town, at the cabin, at the cemetery. They faced west, toward the vast, open country, a blank page on which they could write a new story. They were not escaping a past that had been faced and conquered. They were riding toward a beginning. 2 wounded hearts, stitched together by truth and survival, ready to find their way home. Sometime later, as the wagon jostled along a dusty, sun-drenched track, Clara took out her journal. With the steady rumble of the wheels beneath her, she began to write. Not a letter of fear to a friend she did not have, but a letter of hope to the future she was finally ready to claim. My dearest, I write this not knowing who will read it. Perhaps no one. Perhaps, one day, a child of my own. I want them to know that a life can break and still be mended. I want them to know that the deepest canyons are not in the earth, but in the heart, and that it is possible to climb out of them. I once believed I was destined to be alone, to be a ghost, haunted by the past. But I have learned that love is not about never falling. It is about having someone who will not let you go when you do. We are on a new road now. With the sun on our faces, I do not know where it will lead. I only know that I am not afraid. This time I didn't fall alone. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.